Okay, put your hands up if you can remember where you were on September 11th. Okay, put them down because I don't care. However, what I want to address today is perhaps the 9/11 toolkit and perhaps what it means for international relations as a discipline. What are some of the costs philosophically, methodologically and ethically that occur when we go from the 9/11 toolkit? It might sound a bit negative, but in fact I hope that there's a positive sort of message to be derived from this, which is that the study of international relations, as Aidan pointed out, obviously there's been a sort of a renaissance in international relations, manifested largely also in the fact that we all have jobs, which is nice. However, I do want to suggest that there are some problems associated with this. But one thing I think is important to note is that I think 9/11 has revived an interest in geopolitics. And whilst many scholars in international relations, possibly in the 1990s, tinkered with a lot of the normative landscape of international relations and perhaps sort of envisaged a Kantian, Habermasian vision of international order, which was very much cosmopolitan. And whilst on the other hand, other people were saying, oh, international anarchy, and anarchy is all constructed, anarchy is what states make of it, is that in fact the real political ontology now, folks, is actually geopolitics. But take a deep breath, because I don't actually want to suggest that it's geopolitics in a perhaps traditional or realist way, although many of you will probably identify with that tradition, is that the new geopolitical discourse that has emerged from the post-9/11 landscape, I think, has actually thrown into question our capacity to understand international order. That how we've been communicating and what we've been communicating has in fact not been communication as such, but we've been speaking at cross purposes, we've been perhaps putting together security strategies that bear no correlation to actual security threats, and that in fact the international order is not characterised by one singular response to 9/11, but in fact a plural response. So if we are to characterise international order, and our international political condition is inherently based on difference, it's based on pluralisms. And for that reason I think we should be a bit careful about invoking the September 11, 9/11, why don't we say 11/9? These are types of questions that I think bring to the fact that 9/11 is a disparate framework of understanding, and that our responses to them are varied and textured in very different ways. So I asked the question, why should we, why I don't care where you were on September 11? And the reason is because I think what that has done is encourage a particular form of emotivism, a sort of an inability to move beyond yourself, and to think of it, as Dubièche suggested, as a filmic or film experience. So what I want to also suggest is that we need to be careful about romanticising the order that existed before September 11. That there are clear breaks in history. We largely do this with the history of the 20th century, the League of Nations, the World War I League of Nations, World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War era, the turn to normativism and intervention and looking at humanitarianism. But I think we should be careful of thinking of history, and particularly international relations in this way, particularly as students, is because it's very narrow, and what it does is replicate some very crude political antinomies or dichotomies in international politics. So the distinction between North and South, East and West, between people who are enlightened, people who are barbarians, people who are secular versus people who are religious, all of these types of binary discourses that have emerged and perhaps articulated very much through the 9/11 toolkit don't do us any good. They don't do the work that scholarship in international relations should be performing. So as I ask scholars, I think we might want to document the way in the world has changed, and in some ways our title reflects that. But I think we should be careful about describing what the world was before September 11 as if it was clear-cut and we knew where we stood because we could identify that people wore a uniform, we knew which person to kill. It was so much easier. And now it's all been all our assumptions have been thrown into the air. But geopolitics is important to the study of international relations, and it's important not because it necessarily defines territories and states in classic conceptions of the state, but because it allows us to see how order in international politics and communication is very much spatialised. I was very fortunate, I've seen someone tweeting and I've been tweeting back. But what we do have is, again, a new understanding of what discourse is, and there are multiple overlapping discourses around order, around what 9/11 means. So I think we should resist the tendency to treat this as a us versus them question, obviously, but to work towards an understanding of states and non-state actors as being very much historical, as being spatialised and operating, I think, in very multiple and different ways. And for example, not all terrorisms are created equally. Not all terrorisms or terrorist violence involves similar strategies that were used on September 11. So for instance, a huge amount of Australians died in Bali in 2005, and instantly the Australian media kept on talking about it being Australia's September 11. Well, no, it was a separate act. It belonged to a separate order, and it belonged, if you look at Indonesian terrorism, to obviously different political actors. Likewise, Russia's president at the time described the Georgian attacks as being Russia's own 9/11, and we've seen this also in some ways in Madrid, and we've seen sort of responses. So the 9/11 toolkit is a way of explaining something, but I don't think that explanation is sufficient. So I think we should be careful about reaching for that toolkit for a number of reasons. First of all, because we are good students of international relations, and we're not just doing news and current affairs, is that we need to understand international relation as a methodological question. So if we're to study the contours of international order, then we need to, I think, engage in a deeper form of political ethnography. In other words, we need to understand why there are differences in the international order and how these emerge. Very similar to perhaps some of the themes that Divesh was talking about earlier. Ethically, if we are to think of international relations as a discipline, then we shouldn't be guided by September 11 exclusively and its policies. So if all we were to understand international relations were the toolkit or the structures of security strategy, you know, and various things like Joint Vision 2010 and Joint Vision 2010 to 2020, which are fantastic pieces of political fiction, then we see, I think, we mirror the subject. We don't retain that critical distance that we need as students of international relations. And also, violence and international relations, obviously, if there was no war, well, perhaps would there still be international relations, but we shouldn't theorise from the position of violence exclusively. So that I think when we talk about violence, there are continuums of violence. The fact that a violence is state-sanctioned and is given the name war, or in one other context given humanitarian intervention, or given terrorism in another context, doesn't overlook the fact that what's going on here in terrorist sort of acts is a form of power and movement, that we need to understand the dislocation of certain peoples and certain objectives. And finally, we are students of international relations, politics and development and all the other wonderful subject groups that we have here at this university, and you know, I appreciate that. But what we should be careful of is framing geopolitics of September 11 as a little game of people, you know, playing toy soldiers or battleships, and this is what the terrorists want, and this is, you know, this is a very tabloid form of understanding. And for that reason, I think we need to pay attention to the history of different political groupings. The world is plural, and that meanings are also plural. We live in a pluriverse, not a universe. And for this reason, power and how power operates and circulates is really key to understanding and assessing the impact of September 11.